I see that we have a quorum. Let's begin. I must inform committee members that the clerk of the committee can only receive motions for the election of the chair. The clerk cannot receive other types of motions, cannot entertain points of order, or participate in debate. We can now proceed to the election of the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1062 and the motion that was adopted by the House on September 23rd, 2020, the chair must be a member of the government party. I am now ready to receive motions for the chair. If you can just please unmute and let me know that you have a motion.
Madam Chair, I wish to nominate on behalf of the Liberal side the Honourable Jeff Regan to serve as chair of the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. It has been moved by Mr. Fragiskatos that Mr. Jeff Regan be elected chair of the committee. Are there any further motions?
Could I move that the Honourable Jeff Regan return home and seek the leadership of the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia and the next premier of his great province?
I'm afraid that is more under debate.
And he's not leaving me any time because the deadline is today. I'd have to, get 100 signatures and raise $10,000 by today at 5 o'clock. So I think it's a little too late, John.
Well, I can give you the signature, not the money.
But I appreciate it.
Thank you. Seeing no other motions, I declare the motion carried and Mr. Regan duly elected chair of the committee. Congratulations, Mr. Regan.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No, I just invite you to take the virtual chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk, and I thank my colleagues for their confidence. I don't know what it says about their judgment, but I appreciate it. So I think we can go on now, Madam Clerk, to the discussion of future business, I presume.
Well, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Chong.
Merci.
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you. Congratulations, Mr. Regan, for being elected as chair of this committee. I would like to move a motion for vice chair.
Je nomine mon...
So I would like to move that my colleague, Mr. Janis, be elected as vice chair of the committee.
Please.
So pursuant to the motion adopted on September 23rd, 2020, the committee can also elect 3 vice chairs. So one from the official opposition, one from the Bloc Québécois, and a vice chair from the New Democratic Party as well. And it has been moved by Mr. Chong that Mr. Janis be elected as a vice chair of the committee. Are there any further motions?
Madame la Greffière, ici.
Madam Clerk, I would like to propose Mr. Bergeron as second vice chair of this committee. Perfect, thank you very much. This will happen in a few minutes. As for the Conservatives, do we have any other motions on the table?
Motion carried and Mr. Janis duly elected vice chair of the committee. Congratulations, Mr. Janis.
Madam Clerk, I've seen Mr. Harris's hand up a few times. You might want to go to him.
Of course. You are on mute, Mr. Harris.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Dubourg beat me to it in nominating Mr. Bergeron for the Bloc Québécois vice chair, and I would invite someone to be kind enough to nominate me for the Bloc for the NDP.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, I would like to propose that Mr. Jack Harris be elected as third vice chair of the committee.
If we can just go back to the second proposition for a vice chair. Donc, si on retourne.
L'enthousiasme, Madame la Présidente.
We're just so happy to be back, Madam Clerk.
Donc, pour le vice-président du Bloc québécois, il a été.
So, it has been moved by Mr. Dubourg that Mr. Bergeron be elected as second vice chair of the committee. Does it please the committee to adopt the motion?
Claire, Monsieur.
Perfect. So, I declare Mr. Bergeron duly elected as second vice chair of the committee. Thank you, dear colleagues.
The vice chair from the New Democratic Party, we have Mr. Chong that nominated Mr. Harris. Are there any further motions? Seeing none, is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? All right. I declare the motion carried and Mr. Harris duly elected as vice chair of the committee. Congratulations to all of you. And Mr. Chair, it's back to you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, for giving me the indication of when it's the right time to go on to questions about future business. I see Mr. Fragiskatos has his hand up, and I'll try to keep an eye out and make a list of those who use the. Please use. I don't know if I can. Hopefully, I'll be able to see the raised hand function if you use it. But I see Mr. Harris after that for the moment. So let's carry on.
Mr. Chair, if I could, I propose to read routine motions into the record to structure the committee.
All right. I think that I guess we can go ahead with that now. And after that, I'll go to Mr. Harris. I think that's but we may have, of course, discussion of that once those are read in. So why don't you go ahead and read those? I think that's the proper procedure. And
Point of
then we
order.
can-
Point of
Yeah,
order,
yes,
Chair.
Mr. Harris. Yes.
Just as a point of order, yesterday we did this in proc, and there were some suggested amendments. And the initial motion was to approve them all as one, but perhaps might be helpful to just identify the particular ones where there may be a suggested amendment before Mr. Fragiskatos moves an entire motion. Wasn't sure what his plan was.
So I think Mr. Oliphant has his hand up in the same point of order. Mr. Oliphant?
But just on that point of order, I just by procedure, I would like to hear the motion, and then it would be open to amendment, but it's very hard for us to not have the motion and discuss amendments. So I just think it would be best if we could get a motion out and then hear any proposed amendments.
And I think Mr. Fragiskatos has the option of doing that in terms of reading the whole motion, and then we can go to discussion after that. And there's a variety of ways the committee, of course, can handle it. So, Mr. Fragiskatos?
Sure, I'll go through them one by one, Mr. Chair. If colleagues have thoughts on what's been raised, of course they're free to do so. Happy to hear views. These are basic routine motions that we've seen in other committees and in this one as well. But to begin, the first routine motion relates to analyst services. It says as follows, that the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist in its work.
So, Mr. Maybe the clerk can assist me. Is it normally do we have them all read and then go on to I was thinking that was going to be the process that Mr. Fragiskatos was proposing. What's normal in these cases, Madam Clerk?
Just so that it be clear for everyone, it's easier to go through one by one and then ask if there is an amendment or a debate and then adopt it and then move on to the next one.
Great. Okay. So is there an amendment or debate in relation to the first one we've just heard? Not seeing any. Is it carried? So, I guess I'll ask you to show me your, those in favor of raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those opposed? Those opposed? Motion carried. Okay, on to the next one, Mr. Fragiskatos.
Thank you, Chair. This is on the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure be established and be composed of 5 members, the chair, 1 member from each party, and that the subcommittee work in a spirit of collaboration.
And Mr. Harris, you're muted.
I'm sorry. The motion adopted in February said that it could be composed of 5 members, the chair, the 3 vice chairs, and 1 other member from the government, and that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure work in a spirit of collaboration. I would suggest that we adopt that wording for this committee.
Anyone else wish to comment on this? Did I see Mr. Oliphant? Did I see your hand up? No.
I was ready to vote. I think.
Oh well.
Okay, I consider it a friendly amendment, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair. I'm fine with that.
That's what I was kind of hoping. Is it agreed as amended, as proposed by Mr. Harris? Is it agreed? If so, please.
Mr. Chair, just a point of order. I wonder if we can do the voting by asking, is it agreed? Are there any objections? And then we can proceed to a vote if there's objection. But if these are mostly going to be carried unanimously, then we can just.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I was looking for a way to do this quickly. So I guess I will say, is it agreed? And are there objections? In other words, if you object, I expect you to raise your hand and then I'll give you the chance to speak. Does that sound like a good way to do this? Okay. Are there any objections? Not hearing none, I consider it to be agreed, right? Okay, it's agreed. So on to the next one.
Meeting without a quorum. That the chair be authorized to hold meetings to receive evidence and to have that evidence printed when a quorum is not present, provided that at least 4 members are present, including 2 members of the opposition and 2 members of the government. But when traveling outside of the parliamentary precinct, that the meeting begin after 15 minutes, regardless of members present.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, I'll consider it agreed. Agreed. Mr. Fragiskatos, the next one, please.
Thanks, Chair. Time for opening remarks and questioning of witnesses. That witnesses be given 5, previously 10, minutes for their opening statement. That at the discretion of the chair during questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for the first questioner and of each party as follows. First round, Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for questioning be as follows. Conservative Party, 5 minutes. Liberal Party, 5 minutes. Conservative Party, 5 minutes. Liberal Party, 5 minutes. Bloc Québécois, 2.5 minutes. And New Democratic Party, 2.5 minutes.
Are there any objections or amendments?
Yep.
I see Mr. Harris and then Mr. Jennings.
Yes, I would like to amend the second round provisions in accordance with the decision of the PROC committee made on the 28th of September, that the second round offer the following rotation: the Conservative Party 5 minutes, Liberal Party 5 minutes, Bloc Québécois 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party 2.5 minutes, Conservative Party 5 minutes, Liberal Party 5 minutes. This has been adopted by some of the other committees as well, and I would urge that we do that. It's deemed to be fairer to all of the parties, given that sometimes the burden falls upon the Bloc Québécois and the NDP to lose time at the end, especially if we're squeezed for time due to the number of witnesses.
So we have a proposed amendment. Mr. Jennings, did you wish to speak to the proposed amendment?
I was going to propose that if Mr. Harris had, yes, this is what I understand has been discussed and agreed. And I think we have had the experience as well at this committee of losing some time at the end. And when you only have that 2.5 minute slot, I understand that it's, it's something to lose when you already are starting with a little bit less time.
Mr. Bergeron?
You're muted.
Mr. Tonsardin?
You're muted, sir. You're on mute, sir. So sorry, Chair. So I wish to say exactly that, based on decisions taken by this committee before prorogation in a spirit of proper collaboration. I certainly would like us to return to that way of proceeding. So I enthusiastically applaud and without any reservation the motion put forward by our NDP member for an amendment.
If there are any objections to Mr. Harris, I see Mr. Oliphant wishing to speak.
I'm not objecting to the amended rotation on the second round. I just want to signal that I would like to not go right to a vote on the amended motion because I'd like to just comment on the time for opening remarks.
Okay, I'm just trying to, the question is whether that's within the amendment or not. I'm not sure it is.
I don't believe it's in the amendment, but sometimes we go from the amendment right to the motion. I just wanted to raise a question about the amended motion once it's done.
Okay, so first let's deal with the motion to amend. Are there any objections to Mr. Harris's motion to amend? Seeing none, I consider it agreed. Now we can go back to the main motion as amended. Mr. Oliphant.
I just want to check on the change in the opening remarks from 10 minutes to 5 minutes, and want to ensure that there is some ability for the chair to have flexibility on that, because I think there will be times when there are witnesses who are a sole witness on a panel, and then there'll be times when there are 3 or 4 witnesses on a panel. And I would think we are doing a disservice to our witnesses by saying that if there are only 2 witnesses, it may be appropriate to have 7.5 minutes each or 10 minutes each. And so I just wanted to check the wording on that to make sure the chair has discretion to manage our time in that normal first part of a say an hour of a session. So I just wanted to have it reread to make sure that the chair, it's not absolute always 5 minutes, because I think that would be a disservice.
Mr. Fradjikakis, could you read that part?
Sure. I think what Mr. Oliphant has put there is quite reasonable, but I'll read it again. That witnesses be given 5, previously 10 minutes for their opening statement, that at the discretion of the chair during questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for each, for the first questioner, and so on and so forth. But the pertinent part was what I just read out there.
I don't detect discretion there in the hands of the chair in that regard, Mr. Oliphant.
Yeah, the discretion part came later. So I think I would propose an amendment, and I could do it either way that the committee likes. Like normally, we could add the word normally be 5 minutes, and that gives then discretion to the chair to move that around. I just think you need that ability because otherwise it just doesn't work. So I move normally.
Okay, so Mr. Harris, do you wish to speak to this particular amendment? Because I have Mr. Jennis also with his hand up. So Mr. Harris?
So I just wanted to support the amendment, but perhaps make it a little broader, because the general yesterday in the Public Safety Committee meeting, we gave the discretion to the chair up front and mentioned 5 to 7 minutes, again with the same discussion as to depending on how many witnesses you had. If you had 3 witnesses, maybe 5 is appropriate, but if you have only 1, 10 minutes might be okay, depending on if it's a 1.5 hour meeting or 1 hour or session. So I think leaving the discretion there with the chair, I think the committee has had enough experience with the chair to be willing to accept the chair using his discretion wisely. And so I think it's quite appropriate for us to do that.
Well, I'm shocked to hear that, but I'll go to Mr. Jennis now.
Yes, maybe just to put a concrete suggestion on the table. Let's amend the motion by adding a line. It could be at the very end of the motion, saying, that the chair be authorized to adjust the time of the opening statement in consultation with the vice chairs.
So, now, are there any objections to that? I guess that's another. It's another option, and it's rather than get into the question of whether or not that's an amendment of your motion, Rob. I think that we should deal with Mr. Jennis's proposal, okay? And if it's accepted, we can go from there, I think. So
I would just say I am fine with that. I can withdraw. It's sort of not right to withdraw, but that's sort of a sub amendment to the amendment, but I would go with it. The point is taken that I would like you to have the ability to do that.
Well, and frankly, I like the idea of doing it in consultation with the vice chairs, because these things that are subjective could be one. It might lead to questions about whether you're being fair. So it's always nice when you have agreement on these things. So do we have any objections to Mr. Jennis's proposal? Seeing none, it's agreed. Now, and does that dispose of that motion entirely? I think it does. So now, Mr. Fradjikakis, on to the next one, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This relates to document distribution. Text is as follows: that the clerk of the committee be authorized to distribute documents to members of the committee only when the documents are available in both official languages, and that witnesses be advised accordingly.
Are there any objections to this motion? Seeing none, it's agreed. Sorry, Mr. Williamson. Sorry.
I'm not hearing them.
Okay, you're not very loud for some
Pardon
reason.
me, pardon me.
John.
My
Oh, that's
microphone
better.
was up in the air.
I've done that.
Excuse me. Does the committee provide translation services if witnesses have their briefs in early enough, or is that always up to the witnesses?
Madam Clerk, could you explain that to us?
Yes, we certainly can if we do have the time. Normally it takes about 72 hours, but
Okay.
yes, we can definitely do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any objections to this motion? Then it's agreed. Mr. Fragiskatis, next motion.
Thank you. This is on working meals, that the clerk of the committee be authorized to make the necessary arrangements to provide working meals for the committee and its subcommittees.
Well,
We
partly
shall
this is
see where that one goes. Obviously, the pandemic has other ideas, but this is the routine motion that we've operated under, and hence I'm introducing it as let's say a matter of convention.
We can use Uber Eats.
Well, there you go. If you wish to make history there, Mr. Geddes, by introducing an amendment that mentions Uber Eats, you'd be the first to do so in parliamentary history, I think.
I'm looking around for any food nearby here in my office. It's a little better at home. But all right, any objections to this motion? Seeing none, it's agreed. Mr. Fragiskatis.
Here too, there's the pandemic has other ideas, but in any case, it is a routine motion that needs to be read into the record. Travel, accommodation, and living expenses of witnesses, that if requested, reasonable travel, accommodation, and living expenses be reimbursed to witnesses not exceeding 2 representatives per organization, provided that in exceptional circumstances, payment for more representatives be made at the discretion of the chair.
Est-ce qu'il y a des commentaires?
Any comments? Is this accepted? Very good.
Thank you, Chair. Access to in-camera meetings. That, unless otherwise ordered, each committee member be allowed to have 1 staff member at an in-camera meeting, and that 1 additional person from each House officer's office be allowed to be present.
Any objections? Qu'est-ce que c'est objection en français?
Objection.
Okay, I should have this.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, yes? Pierre Poilus here. Just a point of clarification, just make sure we all are on the same page. Given the WHIP's personnel presence, WHIP staff, they cannot be there directly if they're in Ottawa, but they can be in virtual in-camera meetings, and they are considered to be House officers, if I'm not mistaken, just to avoid confusion. Is that clear to all? Any other comments? So is the motion carried? Is it accepted? Very well, we've adopted it. Thank you.
Mr. Fragiskatis.
Thank you, Chair. This is the second last motion. It relates to transcripts of in-camera meetings, that 1 copy of the transcript of each in-camera meeting be kept in the committee, in the committee clerk's office for consultation by members of the committee or by their staff.
Are there any objections? Agreed. Next, Mr. Fragiskatis.
Actually, it wasn't the second last motion. There is this is the second last one. It is rather lengthy, so just indulge me for a bit. It's on notice of motion that a 48 hours notice interpreted as 2 nights shall be required for any substantive motion to be considered by the committee unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration, provided that 1, the notice be filled with the clerk of the committee no later than 4 p.m. Eastern time from Monday to Friday, that 2, the motion be distributed to members in both official languages by the clerk on the same day the said notice was transmitted, if it was received no later than the deadline hour, and that 3, notices received after the deadline hour or on non-business days be deemed to have been received during the next business day, and that when the committee is traveling on official business, no substantive motions may be moved.
Just a minute, I'll go to French. Just a second. Est-ce qu'il y a des objections?
Any objections? Not seeing any. The motion is carried. Mr. Fragiskatos.
Thank you very much. Finally, other routine motions adopted that all meetings other than those deemed in camera be televised, or if that is not possible, then webcast.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, agreed.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Harris, point of order.
Yes, I just, I may have missed this properly, but I was looking at the notice of motion from previous times, and what Mr. Fistigaitis read out. One of them says 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday to Friday. The other one has no designation of the time zone. Are we to presume it's Eastern Standard Time, or was that actually said by Mr. Fragiskatos? Do you have the right?
I believe I do, Mr. Chair.
You said Eastern Standard Time?
That's right.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Mr. Harris.
If I missed that, my apologies, but I believe I did read that into the record a few moments ago.
Good to have the clarification, Mr. Janis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move another additional routine motion, and this just responds to an issue that we had in the last session of the committee. There was some confusion, some debate about the application of Standing Order 1064. This is a standing order that applies to every regular committee that allows members of the committee to request a meeting take place, and that's take place. There was some ambiguity about or question about whether or not the standing order applies to a special committee. So in order to just have clarity around that issue, I'd like to move, quote, that the chair be instructed to convene a meeting of the committee within 5 days of the receipt by the clerk of the committee by email of a request signed by any 4 members of the committee, provided that A, the reasons for convening such a meeting shall be stated in the request, and B, there shall be 48 hours notice of the meeting, end of quote. So again, that applies the same rules that exist for all standing committees with respect to special meetings to this committee as well.
Thank you. Before I go to Mr. Oliphant, Madam Clerk, is there anything about that that's not in order?
Not to me. Routine motions are normal motions. It's just that they apply throughout the session.
Thank you very much. Mr. Oliphant.
I just have a concern about it for 2 reasons, and I think we should get clarification from the House on this, not just our own very good procedural clerk. First of all, it's not a routine motion, because we do have routine motions, and this is not routine. We are a special committee. And we're not the only special committee that exists in Parliament, in the last Parliament. And there are standing orders that are related to special committees that are intentionally different from the standing orders that are related to standing committees. So special committees and standing committees are different. And I think that I would like to understand what the thinking is in our Parliament, where they have decided that special committees don't have that same requirement. And I don't want to assume that I know that. I don't want to assume that I know the answer on that, but someone may have intentionally decided to not put that in under the work of a special committee. And there may be a reason for it that may have to do with scheduling, it may have to do with other things. And I think that it's not routine, and so I would like to not vote on that. I'm not saying we defeat it, but I'd like to get some a response from the clerk of the House about the history of why it is intentionally not done in our overall standing orders. I'm not sure how I best accomplish what I want to do in terms of whether I move to adjourn debate on it, which I could do. And now that I have the floor, I could move to adjourn debate, subject to the clerk clarifying this with House officials. Is it possible to do a adjourn debate motion and tag on subject to the clerk verifying that it is an appropriate motion with the House and the history of our standing orders? Being very much, I think we need to honor Parliament, and we are the master of our own house, yes, but we also should honor Parliament. So I would therefore move that we adjourn debate on this, subject to the clerk clarifying the standing orders that apply to standing committees and special committees.
Okay, Madam Clerk, you
I can perhaps just say a few things. So a motion to adjourn is normally not debatable, non-amendable. But if you add a condition saying that the clerk needs to come back to the committee with some kind of information, that becomes amendable and debatable. So it's really your choice, your option of whichever motion you would like to move.
Mr. Oliphant.
I don't want to stifle debate on this. I think it's important, but two principles. One, the principles of the way special committees have been set up. The second principle is just full awareness at this committee. I just think it's difficult when people bring in motions like this that are not routine and without having discussed it with people ahead of time. And I think that was another problem we had in the last Parliament, where things would be brought suddenly to the committee without good process. So, but I don't want to stifle discussion. So if you, my intent is to not close this issue, but to get further information. So I then necessarily have to make it with the caveat that you would, the clerk would do some research for us on it and get back to us. So then I understand it is debatable or amendable. I get that. I could just move to adjournment, but I don't want to do that. I hope we can move to adjournment so you can do your work. Thank
okay,
you.
so in your previous statement, you said I could move. I take it you are now moving that which you said earlier,
Yes,
right?
I
Okay,
will
thank
move that we adjourn debate subject to the clerk verifying with the House the standing orders as they apply to special committees and standing committees to make sure this is not ultra virus.
Okay, so I have on debate on that motion, I have Mr. Frejus-Katos so far.
Just point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bergeron had his hand up first, I think, and then mine was after him. So it may be that others have identified their desire to speak in other ways, but that's just what the participants tab shows.
I appreciate your help very much because it is possible for me to miss that. So I saw Mr. Frejus-Katos earlier, then I'll go to Mr. Bergeron and then Mr. Jennis, okay? Mr. Frejus-Katos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize I'm the one introducing the routine motions, but as a member of the committee, I also feel compelled to offer comment too. And I echo what Mr. Oliphant has said. I'm not so sure that special committees possess this power. And so we should err on the side of prudence and be as careful as possible. I think that what Mr. Oliphant has proposed is not unreasonable at all. He has not dismissed what Mr. Jennis is saying, but in a spirit of making sure that we are doing everything as we should be, I think it makes a lot of sense to adjourn and to allow the clerk to look into this for us. And of course, we can revisit the issue. I, like Mr. Oliphant, am not close to that. Be very happy to discuss this further, but making sure that we're on the right footing here. Thank you.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I must admit that I'm a bit uncomfortable with this motion by Mr. Oliphant. It's not about the substance, but about the form. The clerk indicated that the motion was in order. So apparently a special committee wouldn't have the opportunity to call a meeting at the request of 4 members. Well, the clerk is saying that this motion is in order. So my tendency would be to vote on the motion immediately and not push it back to a later date. That being said, I understand the reservations of Mr. Oliphant. I myself have in the past expressed reservations on motions that were introduced without us having the opportunity to read it, to discuss it, to become familiar with it. Now, about Regulation 106, that didn't apply to committees. 4 members of a political party were able to call a meeting of this committee, which gave the impression that it was a partisan maneuver, whereas this committee, based on my understanding, and based on the routine motions that we just adopted and that were adopted in the past, was supposed to work collaboratively. If I can make an amendment to Mr. Genes's motion, it would be that there be 4 members representing at least 2 political parties.
We have an amendment on the floor, and
Mr. Oliphant, point of order.
Yes, it's a point of order. We have an amendment on the floor, and now the member is giving an amendment to the original amendment, but we have a motion on the floor, which is to adjourn debate. We're not talking about the original motion. So I just want to call us. I think that due process is really good. It works, but but we can't be now amending that motion while there's a motion on the floor to adjourn debate. Subject to your ruling on that.
Alors, Monsieur le Président,
Monsieur Bergeron, ce que Monsieur Oliphant propose.
Monsieur Bergeron, Mr. Oliphant's objection is that we're not looking at Mr. Genes's proposal. We're looking at Mr. Oliphant's proposal. Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I knew that it wasn't appropriate for me to make an amendment right now, and that's why I used the conditional tense, and that's why I said if it were possible for me to do it now, this is what I would do. But since Mr. Oliphant didn't, or rather, since we have a motion, an adjournment motion for Mr. Genes's motion, I can't. But if he had let me finish, I would have specified what my intention was. Mr. Oliphant doesn't always have the right way of making friends and to get consent from his colleagues for motions that he introduces. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Are there any other comments?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to the conditional discussion of prospective further amendments, very, very open to having discussions about amendments to this motion. I agree with Mr. Bergeron that we should move this forward. Respectfully, I mean, this isn't a question of a substantive issue or study. This is a question of a operating procedure for the committee, which is the item that we're discussing right now. And I don't maybe just respond to some of the things that Mr. Oliphant said, because the issue around whether or not 106.4 applies or not was a question of debate. And I think, to be fair, a point of some disagreement between folks on this committee before, because it was Conservatives who wrote the motion that created this committee, and in it we said that the powers of a regular standing committee would apply to this committee, and in our minds that included standing 106.4. So it's not a question of whether or not the standing orders intended something or other. We were the ones who wrote the motion, and what we intended was for standing order 106.4 to apply. However, subsequent to that, you, Mr. Chair, had suggested that you had a different interpretation of the motion that created it. So what I'm trying to do is insert clarity into a place where there wasn't clarity before, which is to say a standing order which, I can say as some of the people involved in drafting the original motion, it was the intention of the drafters of the motion that created this committee for 1064 to apply as it applies with every other standing committee. That was the intention, and there was a certain interpretation about whether or not it was written in such a way so that it applied. And certainly the committee has a right. It's not a question of needing to get the House's permission. The committee has a right to pass motions with respect to how it schedules meetings. So we can have a conversation about whether the number of members or the formula is exactly right, but the need for this motion is, I think, that with all due respect to our chair, who we all have a great deal of respect for, there should be a mechanism in the rules that allows members of committees to convene a meeting of the committee if there is a period of time during which the chair is deciding not to convene a committee. In the absence of standing 1064, a chair could decide not to convene a committee meeting even when a majority of the committee want to see that meeting convened. And certainly 1064 was used significantly previously on other committees to convene important studies around systemic racism, around a range of other issues at other committees. So I think it's important. Again, we can discuss the particulars of the procedure, but I think it's important that we, at this opening meeting, put in place a procedure that allows members to, a group of members of the committee to summon the committee to meet and proceed with its work. So on that basis, I suggest we vote down Mr. Oliphant's motion.
Monsieur Dubourg, Monsieur Fragiskatos, and Monsieur Harris. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I understand Mr. Genis's motion. There can be specific circumstances where we need to discuss a specific topic, but at the same time, what Mr. Oliphant is saying is that we're a special committee. So there's a clear difference between a standing committee and a special committee. We would need to know if the rules are the same. In the context of COVID-19, we know that House staff have to take measures to ensure that the committees can sit. Now that all committees are sitting, we need to find a good time for Canada-China under 1064 to sit. All that to say that it would be reasonable for us to check. Let's look at PROC. Let's look at what's possible. This is an adjournment motion that Mr. Oliphant has introduced. It's not a dismissal of Mr. Genis's proposal. We're trying to ensure that we're on the same wavelength with those who work in the House so that we can do things properly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Fragiskatos, followed by Mr. Harris and Mr. Paulus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's our first real meeting. I didn't mention this when I spoke a few moments ago, but I think it's a relevant point, and I hope Mr. Genis doesn't take it the wrong way. Surprise motions are just that, surprise motions. And when we had that occur in the previous session, there were members around the table that didn't go for that. It never really served this committee when we had those sorts of motions come up like that out of nowhere as they have today. But in any case, we're here. And as I said before, colleagues on the Liberal side have echoed this. There's no intent here to push this aside. I think what's been suggested is that we leave it for the clerk to look at and then come back and discuss further. For example, if you look at the text of 1064, while the word committees is used, special committees is not used at all. So for that reason, I feel uncomfortable in supporting what Mr. Genis has suggested. I think we have to be completely on side when it comes to parliamentary convention and protocol. And while the motion that Mr. Genis has put forward here today does merit a close look, analysis, and debate, I'm not sure that we're in a position to comment on it without the full analysis given to it by someone who's expert on these things, and that would be the clerk. The other thing I would, and it's the final point, Mr. Chair, I know Mr. Genis has said that this was the intention of the Conservatives, that including something like this was the intention of the Conservatives when they first put the motion forward in Parliament to create a special committee to analyze Canada-China relations. But we cannot analyze intentions. We can't, that's a guessing game if we get into that. We have to analyze facts. And what stands out to me is that 1064 does not say anything about special committees. For that reason, we have to, I believe, leave it in the hands of the clerk. And I would ask Mr. Genis if he would respectfully be open to taking back his motion, taking it off the table, and reintroducing it at such time when we have had the clerk look into the matter and we can debate based on what she finds is appropriate and in order.
I have Mr. Harris next, and then Mr. Paulus.
Thank you, Chair. It's, at first glance, I was inclined to accept Mr. Oliphant's concern about there being a standing order, that there's already been a ruling that applied in one circumstances, but not for special committees, and the question whether or not it's appropriate for us to adopt a standing order of the House as a mechanism for calling a meeting. But I'm persuaded that this is really, whether it's called a power or whether it's called a scheduling issue, is a kind of irrelevant and maybe just a matter of argument as opposed to a matter of interpretation. Just because it's in the standing orders for committees doesn't mean we can't adopt a similar method of scheduling a meeting as a committee, and I'm open to that. I should also remind people that, you know, I was in favor of us having meetings, despite the fact that there was no procedure for doing that other than 1064, and would have supported calling a meeting under those circumstances. But I also point out that the fact that you call a meeting doesn't mean that the 4 people who signed the document have the say as to what goes on at that meeting. You have to state what the purpose is. So the meeting is called, then you show up for the meeting, and then you say, no, we don't want to do that, or no, we're going to meet, but we're not going to have the meeting. We're not going to meet for 2 hours now because we're not prepared to deal with this question. It turns out when we've used this as a party, and we have over the years, particularly in the summer session when there's no meetings, regularly scheduled of committees, to get something on the table, you often end up going to Ottawa for a meeting on the issue, but all there is a meeting that says, no, we're not going to do that, or we'll schedule it for some time down the road. And you get to tell the news media what you wanted to talk about, but you don't get to have the meeting about the substance. So that's the context in which I'm saying that this issue as to whether it's a standing order and what the standing order was intended and what the purpose of it was is all matters of debate. And if if we can debate it another time, I'm mindful of what Mr. Regis-Sada says, that surprise motions don't normally go over that well in this committee because people aren't prepared to deal with them, which may have given rise to Mr. Oliphant's response to wait and give us a chance to think about it. Perhaps it would be wise to put the debate on this issue off for the next meeting and say, okay, let's raise it again the next time people have time to think about it. If Mr. Oliphant wants to consult parliamentary experts on what the purpose of this is, to have his arguments brought forward, that doesn't seem to be an unreasonable thing to do. But I wouldn't say that the question, if the motion that in terms of scheduling is actually in order, and that depends on a ruling of the chair at this meeting, then it's perfectly all right to decide how meetings would be scheduled in the same way that we decide, as a committee when we will have our meetings. We're going to get advice from the House as to when it's possible to have virtual meetings, and it may be that the idea of 5 days is not reasonable, given that the House can't necessarily find a time and the facilities and the virtual, all of the virtual accoutrements that we need to have a meeting. And so that might be something we need to find out first as well. But so I'd be in favor of postponing the discussion, but I don't think we need to have a ruling from someone else as to whether we, outside the committee that is, as to whether or not we can actually consider such a motion.
Mr. Paulus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm a new member of this committee, but I understood something when I read the routine motions. In the article I, it said that this committee has the powers that were given by Parliament. I understand that this is a special committee, but this committee has the same powers as a standing committee, which allows us to act as other standing committees act. I know that, Madam Clerk, you don't take part in debates, but if you could confirm that, that'd be appreciated. And what am I expecting from this committee? I'm not expecting this committee to be stiff. I want this committee to be flexible, to be able to act swiftly, because we are here to intervene. This is a committee for intervention. We mustn't be stiff. This is our duty. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Paulus. I think you asked a question to the clerk. So is it true? Is this committee able to give itself this power? I can intervene, certainly. So yes, indeed, the committee can adopt any routine motion. A routine motion is applied for the whole session for a specific committee. Now, regarding Standing Order 1064, you could get rid of that part of the motion, and the committee can decide when and how it wants to meet. We often say that committees are masters of their own business, but it needs to respect the mandate, and the mandate is pursuant to the motion that was adopted in the House on September 23rd. It is possible to adjourn the debate as was proposed by Mr. Oliphant, but I wasn't sure if there was a condition or not. So if we could debate the motion or not. Thank you very much.
I don't see anyone else wishing to debate Mr. Oliphant and Mr. Jennings.
Okay. Mr. Oliphant first or me? Sorry.
Mr. Oliphant and then Mr.
Okay,
Jennings.
thanks.
I would just like to add that my issue is not about us deciding how we work, when we work, all of that. It's about invoking a section of the standing orders, a standing order that I don't think applies. So absolutely, we could do this. I'm not against it, but I get a little confused because Mr. Jennings said that we could have a situation where a majority of the committee wants to meet and the chair doesn't let it meet. That's quite different than Standing Order 1064, which is not a majority of the committee. And I just think that we take our time on these things. We do it well. I think if this committee wants to set a rule requiring meetings to happen, if 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 members of the committee wanted to meet, that's fine. Absolutely. It's invoking that we should apply a section, a standing order. That's my issue. I know I get a little bit fundamentalist about this, but the standing orders are there to protect us, to help us do our work. And if they're in the way of a special committee doing the work, I'm happy to find a way around the fact that that doesn't apply to do it well. And that's my point. And I know it sounds arcane, but I just want to make sure if the whole part about section 1064 was withdrawn and it was here is an idea that we do, I'm fine with it. I just don't think we have the power to demand a standing order be applied to our work if it doesn't apply.
Well, I think that's the first time I've heard a United Church minister describe himself as fundamentalist. Mr. Jennis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was tempted to make a joke along similar lines, but I think we have a real ecumenical moment of agreement here, insofar as I want to clarify that the motion that I proposed, I referred to 106.4 as explaining why the motion says what it says, but the motion that I put forward does not mention 106.4 at all. It simply creates a procedure. That procedure happens to mimic Standing Order 106.4, but it does not invoke Standing Order 106.4. So the motion that I put forward again was, quote, that the chair be instructed to convene a meeting of the committee within 5 days of the receipt by the clerk of the committee by email of a request signed by any 4 members of the committee, provided that A, the reasons for convening such a meeting shall be stated in the request, and B, there shall be 48 hours notice of the meeting. Again, that mimics the language of Standing 106.4. It does not reference Standing 106.4. So I think the procedural point that Mr. Oliphant raises is addressed there. I will note, and the motion that was put forward that we're kind of operating under says that the committee be granted all of the powers of a standing committee. And that's where the ambiguity came from, is the application of that section, all of the powers of the standing committee. But it certainly has the power to put in place a procedure in terms of scheduling. And again, we can discuss the particulars of that procedure, but absent that procedure, we could have a situation, theoretically, where not only a majority, but all of the committee members, except the chair, wanted the committee to meet and still could not compel the committee to meet. And we did have a situation earlier this year where I think there was a desire on the part of all of the opposition members on the committee to meet in some form, but given the chair's ruling at the time that without this clarification that 106.4 didn't apply, that there wasn't a procedure by which that meeting could be summoned to take place. So, look, I just in general, in terms of the operation of this first meeting, I take the point about people wanting to be informed of motions ahead of time, and this is our first meeting together, and I think we do want to use the time to have discussions about issues, and if we don't, then we're just going to end up scheduling another committee business meeting. I hope there's a will to discuss in general terms, at least, where we're going in terms of agenda after that. I'll leave that for the time being. But we're here. We've got 2 hours scheduled. Let's use the time as much as we can. And I think creating a procedure by which we can have other meetings take place at the will of members is an important part of that. And having the clarity of that at the first meeting is worthwhile. Thank you.
Mr. Prejus-Karas. You're muted.
Yep. No, I am muted. It's the slogan of the pandemic, Mr. Chair. If I could ask Mr. Bergeron, actually, to, because he had put forward a friendly amendment, and, I know what I said earlier, but we also have a lot of important work to do on this committee, and if we can deal with this today, then maybe so be it. If I can ask Mr. Bergeron to read his friendly amendment again, I think there could be a meeting of the minds. I think what Mr. Jennis is talking about, what Mr. Bergeron is talking about, could be amenable to myself and perhaps to my Liberal colleagues. But if Mr. Bergeron wants to go ahead, I'm all ears.
Okay, although we're on
at your discretion, of course.
Well, no, but although we're on Mr. Oliphant's motion, I'm going to switch to French now.
Okay, apologies.
To my mind, I think we can ask Mr. Bergeron to read the motion again, the motion that he wishes to introduce, as soon as we will have finished with Mr. Oliphant's motion, if he wishes. Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur Oliphant, je peux bien revenir sur ce que j'allais proposer. C'est-à-dire que je suis en train
I can certainly go back to what I was about to suggest, being that what I was saying was that what may have been the problem last time was the request made to the chair regarding 4 Conservative MPs. There may have been an impression made that this was a partisan maneuver. Given that we had agreed and have agreed to work in a collaborative manner, what I had meant and what I would like to put forward, Mr. Chair, is to use Mr. Genuis's idea that we speak of 4 MPs of at least 2 of the parties in the committee. Thus, it becomes clear that we are not trying to maneuver to have only one party heard. Would we want to settle for 2 parties, or would we like to have more? But my suggestion is that we ensure or add that the 4 MPs represent at least 2 of the parties on the committee. That's what I intend, inasmuch as I have a chance to go ahead, and we go ahead with Mr. Genuis's motion. Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis.
So point of order, I'm going to try to do something radical here and seek unanimous, everyone's eyes. Okay, so I'm going to propose unanimous consent that we deem Mr. Oliphant's motion withdrawn, that we amend the motion by adding from at least 2 different parties after where it says 4 members of the committee, and that we deem the motion adopted. So if there is unanimous consent, we can do all of those things at once. Withdraw Mr. Oliphant's motion, add in the amendment, and then adopt the motion. That's what I would propose, seek unanimous consent for. And if there isn't, we can do it more slowly and mechanically, but I wonder if there's agreement to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. I see Mr. Oliphant wishing to comment.
I would be happy to give unanimous consent to withdraw my motion to adjourn debate and seek advice. That part is fine. I just don't want to deem a motion adopted that is as complex as that. The reason I say that is because the standing orders at 106.4 with the number 4 is based on a committee of 10 people that does indeed demand what Mr. Bergeron was asking for, because in those 10 members, there's usually 3 Conservatives, 1 New Democrat, 1 Bloc Québécois. So my problem with even the number 4 is it doesn't account for the fact that we have 12 members of the committee, as requested by the Conservative Party. So I know I'm saying, so I am fine, and other members will have their own opinion on unanimous consent. So unanimous consent to withdraw my motion, but I'd like to have a little bit of debate about the appropriate way of getting Mr. Bergeron's desire known, because it is different with 12 members than 10 members.
So does that mean you're withdrawing your motion, Mr. Oliphant? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I can. I always, once a motion has been made, it kind of belongs out there. That's for you to decide. But yes, if you are happy with me to withdraw the motion, I would do that this time.
Let me put it this way. Are there any objections to Mr. Oliphant withdrawing his motion? Seeing none, the motion is withdrawn. Just a second, I'm going to switch to French. Alors.
Very well then. This would be the right time for Mr. Bergeron, if you wish, sir, to put forward your amended motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I said earlier, I would simply like to add, after the element that Mr. Genuis had about the 4 MPs, and then I think that Mr. Oliphant brought up a very relevant point to the effect that if we want to apply Order 106, the committee, which has a little greater number of members, greater than a standard committee, perhaps we should take that into account. But let me simply stick with the amendment I had suggested, which is to add, after 4 MPs representing at least 2 political parties in the committee. Thank you very much. Are there any objections? Mr. Genuis.
objections, I'm happy to proceed on the basis of that amendment. I will just say in terms of Mr. Oliphant's earlier point that I believe Standing Order 1064 just says 4 members. So I mean, it's obviously based on a model of, you know, but the way it works at a standing committee is that any 4 members, including 4 Liberals, 4 Conservatives, could summon a meeting on their own. So this is a much more sort of consultative requirement in terms of engaging multiple parties than exists at other standing committees. But you know, we're comfortable with it, and I suspect if you were to change it from 4 members to 5 members, it would be a distinction without a difference, because you know, likely to get to the 4 members with multiple parties, you'd need, you know, 3 Conservatives, 1 Bloc, and it would just as easy to get 4 in 1 or something like that. So yeah, I don't know if it's a major point either way, but I think Mr. Bergeron's amendment works, and it's something we're willing to accept.
Thank you. Mr. Prejuzkatos.
Thank you. I wanted to hear Mr. Bergeron's amendment because I think it lays down a possible good foundation, but I would put the following to him and to my colleagues here. What about staying with the 4 members view, but 4 members from each of the recognized 4 parties, 1 member from each. So there'd be a Liberal, Conservative, Bloc, and NDP. Now, it wouldn't have to be unanimous. The 4 members would not all have to agree, but you'd have to have a majority to go ahead with a meeting request. Is that something that that colleagues would consider? I think it's a fairer approach with all due respect. You have all recognized parties taking part in the discussion, and it does not require unanimity.
Mr. Prejuzkatos, I don't hear you proposing a motion to amend at this point.
I'm proposing a motion to amend Mr. Bergeron's friendly amendment to Mr. Genis.
As you described. I have Mr. Harris next.
Well, I'll have to, I'm going to speak in opposition to Mr. Prejuzkatos' amendment to the amendment. I'm assuming we're still talking about amendments to an amendment here. No, I think the purpose of the rule, if you want to call it that, in the standing orders, is to allow members who are not a majority to actually force a meeting to take place, at least to have a discussion. If you're going to require all 4 parties to do it, then it just becomes a consensus, which the chair would have to abide by, and I don't think that that's the real purpose of having this rule in the first place. Having more than 1 party is important. In fact, if that rule were in place, the attempt to get this committee going might have succeeded if it wasn't for the manifesto that was in the letter, which might have been more acceptable to more than 1 party and would have gotten greater consent. But now, whether or not the rule would still be able to apply is a different matter. But so I think it's important to have more than 1 party. The rule of 4, your point is well taken. It's not really material whether it's 4 or 5. The idea would still be that there would be a meeting, and a majority would have to decide what to do once that meeting were in fact convened. So I'm speaking both in favor against the sub-amendment and in favor of Mr. Bergeron's amendment, and the fact that we're creating a rule that's just a common sense of application of a similar approach for scheduling that's in Standing Order 106.
Prejuzkatos.
Let me then propose 3. I originally proposed 4 members, but let me propose 3 parties instead of 2. I know we keep going around here, but you know, I think we can come to a resolution, and I'm bending quite a bit there to go back from 4 to 3. What do my colleagues think about that?
Well, so I think you're asking to withdraw your previous motion.
I'm sorry not to follow the procedures correctly here. Yes, I'm withdrawing what I had originally proposed and putting a new motion on the table, a new amendment rather on the table to change the number that Mr. Bergeron had suggested from 2 to 3 parties.
Is it agreed that that Mr. Prejuzkatos can withdraw his original motion to amend? Seeing no objections, it's withdrawn. And is it so? And so you've proposed. You're moving now. The number 3 parties. Is that correct? Okay, so we're debating that question now.
Correct.
All right. Any comments or points on that, Mr. Jennings?
I disagree with the sub amendment that's been proposed for all the reasons that Mr. Harris essentially said, but just to maybe add to that a little bit. Having the 2-party requirement is already substantially beyond what applies to every other standing committee. That's number 1. Number 2, when you're summoning a committee, the logistics involved in getting the letter together. It may be that there's a member that would support it, but isn't able to sign it on short notice. So there maybe is a member that is sort of more neutral on the question. The requirement that you would need to have 3 parties agree before even calling a meeting seems a bit much to me. I think if you have 2 parties that say this merits an emergency meeting, and then after they get together, other members that are maybe a little bit more on the fence can listen to the arguments. I think Mr. Bergeron's proposal here is very reasonable. It's water in our wine because it's a step back from what 1064 says, but very happy to accept that amendment. But the sub amendment is just a bridge too far in terms of trying. I mean, I think it looks like you're trying to just make it as hard as possible to call one of these emergency meetings, and I think it is reasonable that there be a reasonable mechanism for those meetings to be called. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I hope we're going to get to discussion of future business.
J'espère qu'on va pouvoir parler des sujets qu'on va aborder au comité plus tard, mais est-ce qu'il y a d'autres commentaires? On va voter l'amendement. On va voter sur l'amendement de la motion de M. Fragiskatos. M. Harris.
Excuse me, there's no translation.
Oh, that was entirely my fault. I'm sorry, I did not. I had it in the wrong button under translation. Excuse me. Thank you for that. So I would then go to a vote. Seeing no further comments on the motion to amend from Mr. Fragiskatos. Those in favor of Mr. Fragiskatos' motion to amend, please raise your hands. I count 5. Those opposed. Oh, that's 6. I count 6 opposed. I didn't see Mr. Chong's hand for a second there. So the motion is defeated. And now we are back to Mr. Bergeron's motion. Any further debate? Hearing none. Those in favor of Mr. Bergeron's motion, please raise your hand. And those opposed? Seeing none opposed, the motion is carried. That brings us back to the main motion as amended. Any further debate on the main motion as amended? Hearing none, those in favor of the motion as amended, please raise your hands. Those opposed, please raise your hands. Motion carried. Any other route? Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and I mean, I'm at the committee's disposal in terms of how we proceed on this. But I mean, I think it's a good point to at least start in terms of the discussion at the first meeting, which is the fact that as a result of prorogation, we had some outstanding items, some motions that had been adopted by the committee that were sort of not proceeded with as a result of prorogation. So, and maybe it's worthwhile to have a general discussion first, but my suggestion would be that now would be a good time to readopt motions that we have already adopted as a committee. So, there'd be 2 motions, one with respect to Tibet and one with respect to certain witnesses, Mr. McCallum and Mr. Wright, that the committee had unanimously adopted, and I would suggest we re-adopt them to just ensure their application going forward. And then we had also adopted a motion to do a report with respect to the situation in Hong Kong. We have to, I think, consider possible modifications to that motion, but again, I think we owe it to the work we did previously to re-adopt, or in any event consider next steps with respect to these motions. So maybe open that up for discussion before putting anything specific on the table, but worth having a discussion about.
Thank you. I wonder if the clerk could advise us whether, in the event that the committee wished to, is there some simple way to accomplish what Mr. Genis is talking about?
Absolutely. It's just readopting the same motion, essentially.
But do you need to do it one at a time?
It would be preferable, especially since he mentioned that there might be some amendments.
I think that's helpful. Okay, Mr. Harris, and then well, see who else I see.
So of course the committee can do what it wishes. The committee is a different composition than the previous committee. So I would say that if the motions are brought that were brought before, it's fair to say that members of the committee may wish to either comment or debate on them rather than just simply adopt them. But and as has been pointed out, some of the motions were related to particular times and things like that. So I think we need to be careful in trying to adopt them all at once. I think we have to take them one at a time and see whether there is a need for further discussion or debate, or whether we can deal with that today, or whether it's something that's I won't call it perfunctory, but maybe just reiterating things that we've already decided. If there's agreement here, then we can do that simply. If I just be mindful that there may some of the things may require debate. That's all.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing anyone else wanting to comment, Mr. Genis.
Okay, well, maybe to simplify this, I'll start with putting on the table verbatim a motion that was previously adopted, and we can proceed with it or not, of course, as members wish, but that Canada's former ambassadors to the People's Republic of China, the Honorable John McCallum and Robert Wright, be summoned to appear before the committee at a time, date, and location to be determined by the chair and the clerk of the committee.
Is there any debate? Just a second. Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any objections to repassing this motion, but I remember what we said with our previous clerk. Both witnesses were interested in coming before our committee. So if we were to readopt the motion, it will surely maintain their interest in wanting to come before our committee. Thank you very much.
This is a question for you, Mr. Chair, but especially for the clerk. Do we have the ability to summon without an initial invite going to the individuals that Mr. Genis has mentioned?
Mm-hmm. So even if the motion says summon, we usually start with an invitation, and then if they refuse, then we go on to more other procedures.
Okay, I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind here. Sure.
Mr. Oliphant?
I just wanted to check with respect to Mr. Wright. What I understood was he declined due to reasons of being older and not being feeling that he had something to contribute. And I am just wondering what the mover of the motion has in mind for Mr. Wright. I understand McCallum, I get all that, but I'm just wondering about, are we putting pressure on, I believe he's someone in his 80s, and I believe he has not been an ambassador for several decades. And I'm just wondering what we're really trying to accomplish on that one. I mean, Mr. Jenness has made the motion, so he must know Mr. Wright and his work and his age and when he was actually the ambassador.
I see Mr. Jenness raised his hand. Mr. Jenness.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and just to emphasize, the motion that I put forward was to readopt the motion that the committee had previously adopted. So I wanted to, in moving the motion, just be respectful of that precedent. And I believe in the discussion that took place, I think the motion we had initially proposed was just Mr. McCallum, and there was another member that had wanted the inclusion of Mr. Wright. So in any event, I'm happy to remove Mr. Wright. I mean, I think it's particularly important that we hear from Mr. McCallum, given how recently he was the ambassador, and given how his engagement has so much bearing on current events before the committee. So I'm very open to a friendly amendment to remove the reference to Mr. Wright. I only put it in there because this motion is verbatim the motion that was previously adopted. But we can do something different, that's fine.
So before I go to Mr. Harris, let me ask the committee, is it agreed to withdraw the name of Mr. Wright? No, Mr. Harris wishes to comment. Mr. Harris.
Oh, I was only going to comment on Mr. Wright. I understand that we had been advised by the clerk of the committee that Mr. Wright had initially was on declined the invitation, but then when the second request was made after the motion was passed by the committee, that he did agree to attend, and was but with the caveat that he wasn't really au courant with the situation in China. If we wanted him, he would come. So if members feel that's not necessary, I don't have strong feelings one way or the other on Mr. Wright. But if he feels he has nothing to offer, and unless members think that he does, then I'm willing to listen to what people say.
I know Madame Hulk is with us, but she's in support of the clerk today. But my understanding was, in fact, that as that Peter described, that Mr. Wright indicated that he's older, he has very little memory of he doesn't have a lot of memory of the time and so forth. I think that was part of it, but it's up to the committee. Madam Clerk.
If I may just add, he did accept the invitation. He just wanted to make sure that it would be virtual.
Oh, that was Mr. Wright.
Yeah, both of them actually accepted to appear afterwards.
Okay.
What I was just saying then.
Monsieur Bergeron?
Monsieur Bergeron. Yeah, Mr. Chair. That's exactly what I was saying earlier. Both said yes after having been formally asked to appear. If we readopt this motion, especially given that there'll be a cordial invitation sent. Now, given that both expressed interest in appearing, if we adopt the motion as it was written in the last Parliament, that will certainly maintain their interest. We'll call it interest in participating in our work.
I think you said what the normal practice is, but so my question is there anything that prevents the committee from summoning someone if after a prorogation as we've had and a recreation of the committee, it hasn't first invited them? I presume there is nothing, or is there?
So at the moment, we are just readopting the motion if the committee wishes to readopt it. And I will proceed with the invitation first. And then if they both decline again, or one of them decline, we'll get back to the committee, and then the committee can decide on the further actions.
Why would you do that if the committee is adopting a motion to summon them? Is it because there are rules that prevent you from summoning them before they've been first invited?
No. It's just our practice. We just re-invite them usually because it's a new committee, it's a new session, and it's a new motion. So the former summon is no longer in effect. So everything needs to be readopted essentially.
Just point of order,
Mr.
Mr. Chair.
Dennis, help me out. Yeah.
Yeah. So the motion that I put forward, again, designed to be the same as the previous motion, says that they be summoned to appear before the committee at a time. So I am very comfortable with the clerk following a procedure of inviting first and then following up with a summons if the invitation is, because to me that what this motion says is that we are prepared to use the powers of the committee to require these people to appear, but absolutely extend all courtesy that is possible in the context of that expectation.
I think that may be very helpful to the committee. Any objections to that, to following that approach? I don't see any. So then can we carry on to the motion itself before us? Okay, so those in favor of Mr. Jennis's motion, please raise your hands. Those opposed, please raise your hands. Motion carried. Mr. Jennis, you have some more, I think?
Yes. So this is also verbatim from before. It was adopted but not tabled in the House. So the motion is as follows: that this committee call for dialogue between representatives of the Tibetan people, bracket, His Holiness the Dalai Lama or his representatives and/or the Central Tibetan Administration, close bracket, and the government of the People's Republic of China, with a view to enabling Tibet to exercise genuine autonomy within the framework of the Chinese Constitution, and report this motion to the House.
Any debate? Seeing none, those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carried. Mr. Jennis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this.
Sorry, I think Mr. Bergeron is raising. I think he may have a point of order or something. So, okay, if you don't mind.
Je sais pas si on peut appeler ça un rappel.
Well, I don't know if it's a point of order, but we need to remember something. I would like to reiterate something that I've said several times in the past. These reports we're tabling regularly, they need to be considered as temporary reports, since we had agreed to go back to that specific issue of Tibet. And I'm pretty sure that there will be a motion tabled regarding this so that we can continue the study. Thank you very much for your explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I don't recall the committee specifically. Actually, sorry, I wasn't actually able to find it in the minutes, but now that he's mentioning it, I am recalling that Mr. Harris had a previous motion with respect to hearing from officials on the issue of the situation in Tibet. I don't have that motion in front of me. Unfortunately, I did look through the minutes of previous meetings to see what we adopted, and maybe it didn't appear there, or maybe I just missed it. So maybe I wanted to go on to make some suggestions with respect to our study on Hong Kong, but maybe while I do that, if Mr. Bergeron or Mr. Harris want to see if they can find that information.
Mr. Dennis, I think I saw Mr. Harris mouthing that he does have it in front of him. If you want me to go to him now.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I do have it actually from the minutes, a motion by me that was passed by the committee, which said that the committee invite officials from Global Affairs Canada to provide a briefing on the situation in Tibet and Canada's relationship at the earliest opportunity as part of its ongoing study on Canada's relationship with China. So that was important to my support for the motion. The idea of reporting it to the House, it was basically an interim motion, and whether we should be reporting all this stuff to the House in the interim is a different question. But we just passed the motion again. So we have it in front of us, but it was also, from my point of view at least, contingent upon supporting the interim motion that we agreed to look further into this, because the case was we had only heard from one person. We had not heard from any of the other stakeholders, and we didn't really have a briefing as a committee on that point. So it was one of those surprise motions, shall we say, that needed some thought and consideration before the committee was ready to adopt it. But we did indeed adopt it, and I have no hesitation in readopting it today, the first one. But this one here, I think, is important. And if it, in order, Mr. Chair, perhaps I would put that forward now for the committee's approval as a readoption of that motion. So if that being the case, let me move that the committee invite officials from Global Affairs Canada to provide a briefing on the situation in Tibet and Canada's relationship at the earliest opportunity as part of its ongoing study on Canada's relationship with China.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Any debate or comments on this motion? Seeing none, those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. Those opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Mr. Jennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's now, in terms of concluding the business from the previous Parliament, the question of the Hong Kong study. And of course, the Hong Kong study is very important, and it's also fast moving. So, my suggestion would be that we that we bring that study to a conclusion and prepare a report as soon as reasonably possible, because even time has passed since our previous hearing. That said, I would note that there are some people we particularly want to hear from first, and in my mind, a key one was Minister Mendicino. We had talked about needing to dig further into the immigration aspect of it, and there had been an interest and I think agreement that we would hear from Minister Mendicino about the refugee dimension of that, and then also that we give an opportunity for our Consul General in Hong Kong to appear, obviously virtually. So that could be maybe one more meeting, and then in the meantime, inviting our analysts to begin the process of preparing a report so that we can apply that important testimony that we heard in August and share that with our colleagues in the House as quickly as possible. That's not a motion, that's just a point of discussion, I guess, to start us off maybe on this section of it.
That's fine. Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I completely agree with what Mr. Jennis just said. I have two reservations. That being said, one, we're talking about a report that could be tabled. We would need to say that this is a temporary report, because what happens in Hong Kong will have consequences on what's happening in Taiwan. There are global issues. And this cannot necessarily be put in a temporary report, because we won't necessarily be able to have a final report on the issue. Secondly, still regarding what Mr. Jennis said, we had a work plan that was proposed by the analysts, and if I remember correctly, I think we all agreed on the work plan. So what I would propose is to continue our study on Canada-China relations based on the work plan that was proposed by the analysts. And we could still focus on Hong Kong as well. Is this an official proposal? Yes. Madam Clerk, it's an order, if I'm not mistaken. It is an order. Any comments? Mr. Harris, and then Mr. Janice.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree that we ought to. We have a work plan that was adopted. I know there's several new members on our committee, and it might take a little effort to go and have a look at it. And there may be some proposed changes in that work plan, but that's something that perhaps the subcommittee can look at. But you know, we're dealing with some complexities, of course. The idea of an interim report on Hong Kong, I think, was probably agreed to, and we moved into that study because of the urgent nature of things that were happening in Hong Kong during, and which is why we wanted to get the committee back together again, and why it was ultimately agreed to. The events in Hong Kong were extremely important and still are, and is a moving target, as Mr. Janice has pointed out. So I think we did diligent work on the Hong Kong study. We didn't quite finish it. I don't know whether one meeting will be enough. I would suggest that should be discussed at the subcommittee and scheduling issue. We just agreed to deal with Tibet as soon as it's practicable. That's a scheduling issue. But the idea of the general agreement of going by the work plan, I think that's a good starting point. I've looked at a brief look at it today, and there seems to be that we had a lot of work been done by the committee and the subcommittee and by the analysts in preparing a work plan. We may need to make adjustments to it or add different witnesses or whatever, depending on availability, may be totally different. But I am in agreement with Mr. Bergeron's motion. I think the notion that we complete the work on Hong Kong as soon as practicable coming forward can be incorporated. I don't know if it's excluded by Mr. Bergeron's motion because the work plan was there when we embarked on the Hong Kong study. But I think maybe these things can be more readily dealt with. The details can be readily dealt with in the subcommittee on agenda and procedure if that's inherent in the positive support for Mr. Bergeron's motion.
Mr. Janice.
Okay, I am very much in agreement with that. I think that I'm persuaded about the value of proceeding in that fashion. I mean, I think as others have said, as long as there's a consensus that that we're working towards indeed an interim report on the situation in Hong Kong, and that our analysts will begin that process. And I don't know if we need to formally say this, but that interim report will reflect evidence that has been heard in the previous session, as well as the new evidence that we're going to hear. But just to sort of further inform the discussion, I wonder if you, Madam Clerk, could share with us, based on the work plan, you know, if I recall, we had scheduled 4 or 5 meetings, and we did 3 of them. But maybe if you could just refresh us on kind of where those, you know, if we were to be able to proceed exactly according to the work plan and take into consideration witness availability, you know, how many more meetings, which witnesses, and so what does that involve?
Madam Clerk.
Yes, thank you. I would maybe turn to the analysts for that because they have more information about the work plan and all of that, if I may.
Okay, please go ahead.
Hello. Hello, everyone again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The committee had envisioned approximately, I think, 4 to 6 meetings. It would depend, of course, on scheduling availability of certain witnesses. The decision was to have some flexibility there, and 3 full meetings were completed at the time.
But just to follow up on that, could you give us a sense of, because I believe that Minister Medicino, the Consul General, we're already on that work plan in terms of prospective future meetings as well.
Yes.
Okay.
There was a meeting that had been envisioned for August 25th with a full slate of witnesses, and then that meeting was canceled. And then in addition to that, those individuals that you mentioned were discussed as the priorities for the final meetings. So there was the meeting with the remainder of the sort of academic and other witnesses, and then you had discussed as well the minister and the consul general after that.
So just my final comment, Mr. Chair, before I wrap up here, and that's that as long as we're operating under the understanding that yes, we're going to complete the Hong Kong study in the sort of previously envisioned amount of time according to the previously envisioned work plan, and then proceed with an interim report to the House based on that, as discussed. I'm very supportive of proceeding in that fashion.
Thank you. Before I go to Mr. Harris and Mr. Bergeron, I just want to check with the clerk on what the procedure is for us do we need to, if the committee wishes to, does it need to adopt the previous testimony on these topics?
No, that was all covered by the motion that was adopted in the House on September 23rd. All evidence and all documents that were presented to the committee at the last session will carry over. So that's already been dealt with.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Mr. Harris.
Yeah, yes, if I may add to what was provided by the analyst, I'm looking at something in front of me which actually proposed nine meetings beyond the date on which the House was closed down due to the COVID situation, with a priority for future meetings listed as well, 1, 2, 3, 4 items. So I think there was a fairly robust work schedule that was not completed. I only see 1 or 2 of those witnesses that are listed here that actually have testified to date. So we may have to revisit some of that, but there's quite a hefty schedule there that still applies. Now, this was I may be corrected by our analyst, but I'm looking at what was a 27th of February report. The eventual one was adopted on March the 9th, which I just don't have in front of me. So maybe not all of this was adopted, maybe just the first parts of it. So, but there's a fairly large document that was prepared in terms of what the work of the committee might be. So I believe it's in order, given the passage of time, for the subcommittee to look at this and come back with a recommendation to the full committee.
I
saw that the analyst had her hand up. And Mr. Bergeron, would you accept that I ask the analyst to recommend something? Alison. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
There were 2 separate work plans that the committee considered and adopted. There is the larger work plan on the global study that the committee is undertaking, with the date that you mentioned, and as you correctly stated, there's quite a bit left on that document to still undertake. And then there was the specific work plan on the Hong Kong meetings that the committee had been working its way through as well.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing to add to what Mr. Harris has just said. Just to be clear about the Consul General, Mr. Genius went back to this. Our analyst has confirmed the matter. We had a discussion because there was a motion to invite the Consul General. I believe it was the Consul General of Vancouver, and I had spoken up to say that the Montreal Consul General had also intervened, and that rather than inviting the one from any specific city, it might be smarter to invite the ambassador of the People's Republic of China. And we had agreed that the PRC ambassador would be invited. In any case, he wished to meet the members of this committee. So I suggest that the PRC ambassador be the one that we meet. Thank you very much. Is this necessarily the object of a motion? Is it a motion, Mr. Bergeron? I'm not sure if it's necessary to make of this a motion, inasmuch as we had agreed to receive the ambassador of the People's Republic of China rather than anyone else. I just wanted to mention this so that we could sort of put aside anyone else and focus on this ambassador who, as I said, had in any case made it known that he wished to meet us in one forum or another. I remember that very well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Jennings, I'm sorry. You know what? I had Mr.
Harris's
Harris's hand first. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add something, a different point in relation to us going forward. Mr. Jennis suggested that the analysts be asked to start preparing a report on Hong Kong. I would say that such an item is premature. I think keeping in mind that it's an interim report and we're probably only talking about things that might be important for the government to do or to recommend for today, and the larger questions may be left till the end. Perhaps what we can do is ask the analyst, and perhaps it's already been done, but maybe it didn't happen because of prorogation, the committee didn't exist, but perhaps we can ask if the analysts are able to provide or work on at least a summary of the evidence so that we can have something to review. Particularly there's new members of the committee. I wouldn't want them to have to go and read through the entire transcripts of all of the meetings that we've had. I think that would be a bit onerous. But since we are bringing forth the evidence is before us, and if there was a summary of it from the analysts for the use of the full committee, that might make the process move along a little more quickly and smoothly. And given the fact that there's a constituency week coming up, if that process were started now, that would at least save us a week of waiting or a week before we ask such a question. That's up to the chair and the committee to advise, of course. And if that's compatible with the analyst's work schedule, then that would be great.
Before I go to Mr. Jennis and then Mr. Oliphant, I think I asked the analyst, Allison, do you, would I be mistaken to think that you probably do that as we go along, and that may exist and be available for members pretty soon or in a fairly short order, so members could review that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. An evidence summary has been prepared and has been sent to the clerk if it is the committee's will to have it distributed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any debate on the idea of having it distributed? Is it agreed that we have it distributed? No, it's agreed? Okay, then I'll direct the clerk to distribute it, and then I'll go to Mr. Jennis and then Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly.
Point of order. Sorry.
Just on John Williamson, on the distribution, is that considered an internal document? Just to clarify that, I assume it is, but.
Thank you. It is my view. It is considered an internal document, so I'd ask members to keep it in confidence. Yes. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, just wanted to briefly clarify 2 points that were raised in terms of Mr. Bergeron's latest intervention. And I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about this. What I had meant to refer to was having the Consul General of Canada to Hong Kong, our representative in Hong Kong. And that was a separate discussion from having inviting a representative of the PRC in Canada, which I agree is also worthwhile. And I agree that the appropriate person to extend that invitation to would be the ambassador. With respect to Mr. Harris was talking about essentially the two different work plans. I think definitely we should be guided by our the work plan with respect to the Hong Kong study in particular in the short term as we complete the Hong Kong study. I do think the longer term work plan will probably be something we want to revisit in the subcommittee and have a wider conversation about, recognizing that a lot has changed. There's a lot new in the context of the relationship between Canada and China since we had previously discussed that work plan. All of the circumstances around COVID-19, around I don't need to list them. Everybody knows. So a lot has changed. So not to say we might not want to be guided to some extent by that as well, but I think what I was proposing in particular is the Hong Kong work plan, that we use that as a guide for the Hong Kong study, but then maybe we have a separate conversation at subcommittee about the sort of global work plan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant.
Note this for posterity. I'm agreeing with Garnet on this. 2 points. I think as a federal parliament, our most appropriate invitation would be to China's ambassador to Canada, not a consul general. If the ambassador wanted to include one of his consuls general from Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver, wherever, that would be fine. So that I wanted to just make sure that we were on the same page on that. having Canada's Consul General to Hong Kong, I am also supportive of. The second point, and I was going to raise, is that I would think it's appropriate to finish our work plan on Hong Kong, but then I really think we need to have a subcommittee on agenda and planning to look at what we do after that. I think that there's some important issues around world events, around COVID, around security, etc. I think we just need to rejig that a little bit. And if that means that the subcommittee needs to do a little extra work so that we don't lose too much time, I think I'll agree to that. But I just don't want to assume we're back exactly where we were before when we were finishing the Hong Kong report.
You are on mute, Mr. Chair.
Well, I sound much better that way, you know. and I might even sound more intelligent that way, but that's another matter. So I don't think we have any motions before us, but we've had a discussion about where to go from here. And we have a pretty clear direction, I think. I see Mr. Jennis raising his hand. So, Mr. Jennis.
Well, I guess it was just on the next matter, which I think is when we want to have our meetings again, which is another thing I think we need to discuss. But I'm bringing that up on the assumption that we've already established a path forward vis-a-vis the Hong Kong study, which I think we have. Is that right?
That's my impression.
Okay. All right. So just you know,
I do see Mr. Bergeron wishing
all right.
to intervene on this. Okay. Alors, just a second now. Monsieur Bergeron?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Unless I'm mistaken, I do think that I proposed and the clerk had agreed that if we pick up the work as laid out in the work plan submitted by the analysts, beginning, of course, with the special situation in Hong Kong, then that will be agreeable to me.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having reminded me of that way of putting it. I think you're right. Are there any other comments on this motion? Just 1 second here. I'm not seeing any. Those who are in favor, hands, please.
Mr. Chair, I did have my hand up. I think the implication of Mr. Bergeron's motion is that both work plans go to the subcommittee so that the scheduling or whatever fixes may need to be done can be done there instead of just adopting the existing work plans. Is that inherent in your motion, Mr. Bergeron?
Monsieur Bergeron.
Je crois.
I do believe, indeed, that when it comes to the details, we would have to have a subcommittee meeting, which leads me to ask, Chair, whether we need a motion to strike the committee, strike up the committee, that subcommittee. Was that one of the routine motions at the outset? Yes, the clerk seems to be telling me that this has already been done. Yes, it has been done. Okay, good.
We just propose, instead of going back to the subcommittee specifically on the Hong Kong study, that we leave it to the discretion of the chair to seek to schedule as soon as possible the witnesses that we had already proposed to hear from. I think that's just the most kind of expeditious way of moving forward on that.
Thank you. Mr. Harris? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm objecting to that. I mean, the study was there, but that was over a month and a half ago. Mr. Jennis wants to have one more meeting. What witnesses were left, I don't know. I think we should really have a look at it at the moment and see whether we need one meeting or two, or we can get, or whether we need new witnesses. We don't know. We've had a considerable effort put in. We're going to have a summary of evidence. If there's pieces missing that need to be added, then I think we should have an opportunity to add it. This is a new committee, unless if we want to be ironclad to the work plan that was there, then that's the committee's wish. But I think that it makes sense for us to assess how far we've gotten, make sure we're not leaving anything out, and make a decision in the subcommittee. But that doesn't stop us from, the chair can go ahead, and if we do have a meeting coming up, whenever it's decided when we're allowed to meet, then surely we can continue with some of the witnesses that are available. But I don't think we need to foreclose any possibility of adjustments to that committee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Oliphant, I see your hand up, but did I cut you off, Mr. Jennings, before I go, Mr. Oliphant, or will I?
No. That's I just think that's fine. We can kind of proceed in the fashion Mr. Harris proposed.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant.
Correction something.
Oh, sorry. Okay, we're at the end of our time, but I think we have a view. I think we're clear here. I don't want to summarize as I fear getting it wrong, and I may have to go to the clerk to get the summary afterwards. But I think we need to have a subcommittee meeting soon, and we need to work toward the next meeting of the full committee on the subject of Hong Kong. And I do see. Et je vois la main de Monsieur.
And I see Mr. Bergeron's hand up. I was wondering, Mr. Chair, whether this would be a good time to discuss, and of course we're running out of time, but whether we should discuss the manner in which we would like to meet. Would we like to continue meeting virtually like this? Would we like a hybrid meeting? I think I understand that for certain reasons, members of our committee, in particular Mr. Harris, who will prefer working virtually, at least in the immediate. But perhaps we could start at least allowing some of the members of our committee to meet in person, or thus having hybrid meetings. I think we're able, technically speaking, to organize hybrid meetings with physical distancing ensured for anyone physically present, still allowing external members to join virtually.
Okay, merci. Madame la Greffière, est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose qui...
Madam Clerk, if there are... My understanding is that currently there are only virtual meetings. There is no one in person. Is the interpretation working on the English channel? Is the interpretation working on the English channel?
French is being is Mr. Bergeron getting the French translation is working. Okay, I guess I'll go on in English, although we need to have both the interpretation, in both languages working, of course. So where was I?
On hybrid meetings.
Thank you so much. So what is the situation in relation to that, Madam Clerk? Is there a rule of some sort been set by the House, or where are we?
Yes, so we're looking back again at the motion that was adopted on September 23rd, which states that the first meeting had to be virtual, but then they're all hybrid. So it's really the choice of the member. So the member can come in person if she or he wants. That's totally acceptable, or also virtually as well. So we'll have the two options. The only thing is, if you would like to have some food or anything, please let me know in advance if you'll be there in person, so I can take care of that. But other than that, it's really up to the member.
Alors, j'espère que l'interprétation.
I hope the interpretation is not working. I think that answers Mr. Bergeron's question. Mr. Harris.
Thank you. I just maybe the clerk can help us with this. whether we're having a virtual meeting or a hybrid meeting, does that have any difference with respect to the scheduling? Is one more easier than the other, or they're on the same footing in terms of there's no constriction on our time if we're using one or the other?
So
or the opportunity. If you know,
even
what,
if
do you understand my question?
yes.
Does it limit our flexibility if we choose one versus the other?
So basically, at the moment, only 4 committees can sit at a time, even if it's hybrid or all virtual, because both meetings need to have a Zoom link and all the tech requirements and all of that.
And I can tell you that for those of us in Atlantic Canada, and there are 3 of us, Mr. Harris, Ms. Zan, and me. I think I'm not missing. Oh, and Mr. Williamson. Pardon me. You know, some may go to Ottawa and come back, but I think I don't know if this is the case for all 4 provinces, but certainly in my province, when you come back, you have to self-isolate for 14 days, which is, and Mr. Harris also. Is that also the case in New Brunswick, Mr. Williamson?
It's not legally, but I came back after the caucus meeting and was aware every day of those 14 days I was out that it'd be a bad political move to spread COVID. So when I return next time, I'm going to self-monitor and stay close to home, but I will allow myself to walk my dog off my property because I live on a quiet street with no other homes. So technically no, but politically yes. How's that for an answer?
Oh, that's fine. That's very helpful. At any rate, you can see there are certain constraints because of that. So I expect that some of us will continue to wish to do the hybrid model, but we now know how this can work. So with that, I don't see anything. Oh, just a second. Hopefully we're going to close in a moment, but first, Mr. Paulus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to be impolite. We've taken a lot of time on procedure, but I had a motion to introduce to send to the committee. I think that can happen within a few minutes. May I introduce the motion? Go ahead. Here's the motion that the committee study national security issues over 4 or 5 meetings, including cybersecurity and the threat of foreign interference, and that the committee provide a report to the House. This is a motion that brings us into the future once we've finished the work that's currently underway. It's also related to cybersecurity, national cybersecurity, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on Canada. I think that's something we need to do as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Paulus. We don't really have time to debate that motion. I see that Mr. Bergeron has a comment to make. I'll go to Mr. Bergeron, but you'll understand that we have to end the meeting fairly quickly. Okay, I'd just like to reassure Mr. Paulus, in our work plan on Chinese-Canada relations, part of our work has to do with security. Therefore, if we don't have time to adopt the motion today, I'd just like to tell Mr. Paulus and reassure him that it's not because we won't be debating it, that it is an important issue because it's already in the work plan that we agreed on just a few minutes ago. Thank you very much. I'm still going to ask the committee if there are any objections to the motion. If we wish to debate the issue, we should wait till the next meeting, in my opinion. I see Mr. Harris wants to speak, but after Mr. Harris, I'll ask the committee whether they want to adopt the motion. And if they want to debate it, then I think we should wait till the next meeting. Mr. Harris.
Yes, I would think it would require some debate. There's elements of the motion in terms of what we would do, when we would do it, and all of that. I think this is something that I agree with Mr. Bergeron is already in the work plan, but he's basically setting an agenda item as to what will happen next. And I don't think that that's something that we need a debate about that. If that's the will of the committee, obviously we will go from Hong Kong to his study, but we do have a work plan, and I think adjustments to that would have to be either debated or at least discussed in the Agenda and Procedures Committee before I'm ready to adopt it personally. But there's nothing wrong with the content in terms of, but there are several items there. The Chinese government. Well, he's talked about the Communist Party, but the Chinese government influence on Canada is on our agenda. Security is, cybersecurity is, and it'll be part of our overall study. But the timing of it and all of that matters for debate and discussion. And I suggest that they be that such a motion would be sent to the committee for consideration.
Thank you very much. Alors, Mr. Paulus.
So, Mr. Paulus, thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Harris, those were comments that I made after introducing the motion when I talked about the Communist Party. It's not included in the motion. My motion is quite general. We can adopt it, and then the subcommittee can carry out an analysis. The motion is a fairly general one. It has to do with cybersecurity and national security in general. Okay, we've gone beyond our time. Does the committee want us to debate this issue at a later date? Are there any objections to waiting and debating it at the next meeting?
Clarify the process around that. So if you can, is it that you adjourn the meeting and then we kind of resume consideration of the motion when we resume as a committee, or do we have to dispose of it in some way before you adjourn, or what's the process wise? I'm just trying to understand.
Well, my problem is that, with this technology, I know we have limits on how long we have the Zoom call, and so I'm afraid that it's about to expire momentarily, and we're going to run out of time, right? So we can't go on an unlimited basis. We're beyond the 2 hours, and so I'm therefore trying to do this with agreement, and I think it's hard for us to have to go on with debating this because of the time not being allowed, and therefore what I'm proposing is that this motion come back to the committee for discussion when we reunite, having in mind, of course, that the subcommittee will probably have this topic and the fact that it's been proposed in its mind when it meets. Does that help, Mr. Jenness?
Yeah, it understands where we're going on it. Yeah, I guess it's a question of if people are prepared to support it now, or if not, then we obviously can't proceed on that. So,
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Harris,
is it possible for us to refer the motion to the Committee on Agenda Procedures for discussion and recommendation, or is that out of order?
Let me ask the clerk if that's out of order.
It's just now because of a matter of time. I'm wondering if it's kind of a motion to adjourn that you're trying to make, and that the matter be referred to the subcommittee, because the motion can also be moved at subcommittee also.
You're telling us we're out of time. Jack, is that what? Sorry, Mr. Harris, is that what you have in mind?
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Paulus.
Point d'ordre.
Okay, point of order, Mr. Paulus. There's no time limit for Zoom. It's the committee that decides when the committee adjourns. I don't want to go on forever and ever, but it's just, I just want to mention that there's no time limit for a Zoom call.
I do.
Well, if you talk to the whips, you'll find out that there are limits.
You heard what the clerk had to say. Are you proposing a motion of adjournment with this motion being referred to the subcommittee?
Well, now let me see. I don't want to insult Mr. Paulus. If he wants the full committee to debate this, then the full committee can debate it. But I was, in light of what Mr. Bergeron had to say and my awareness of what's on the committee, is a question of what priority would be given to this. I would prefer to have the Agenda and Procedures Committee, which is represented by all of the parties here, to have an opportunity to consider what the priority, whether we would give a priority to that as a group and make a recommendation, or at least take it into consideration as a subcommittee before the full committee makes a decision. That's my preference. But I don't want to insult Mr. This is a, I didn't think we were setting priorities here today, frankly. And aside from things that had already been dealt with by the committee in terms of Hong Kong and the passing those motions. So this is essentially new business for today. And on that basis, I'd prefer to have it go to the committee first.
Thank you. Je pense que.
I think Mr. Bergeron's hand, and then Mr. Oliphant and Mr. Fragiskatos. I'm not sure when we're going to be out of here. Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to suggest that there may be other comments on the motion, and I can see that there are. This may not be the best solution, but it might be a good solution in the circumstances that we adjourn and that we discuss this motion at our first opportunity, either in a subcommittee or in our next committee meeting. Is that an adjournment motion? Well, I don't mean to disregard Mr. Paulus's motion. I'm ready to debate it now. It seems that there are other comments, that we don't have very much time to hear those comments. I propose that we adjourn and that Mr. Paulus's motion be addressed at the first opportunity at our next meeting, either in subcommittee or full committee. Thank you very much.
Committee now. Those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. Those opposed to the motion, please raise your hands. Motion carried. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Everybody.